Is it okay if I stay sitting, or you prefer me standing? No, you allow me to stay sitting. Thanks a lot. So, multinational federation and the impact of globalization on multinational federations. What is it take? I would say multinational federation is probably, and in most cases, an oxymoron. And globalization is a very fuzzy and overused concept. But it happens that multinational federations could be better suited than other forms of polities to absorb the impact of globalization. So I shall argue that globalization's impact on a multinational federation will bear both on the nation themselves and the relationship within the federation, as well as on the structure of the federation, potentially unsettling equilibriums between the different national groups within the federal institutional scheme. But before doing all that, let me first thank Joanne Poirier and Markel Chair in Federalism for inviting me here in Montreal for a month, staying as a scholar, and also thanks to the Groupe de Recherche sur les Sociétés Plurinationales, who also associated itself to my coming here to Montreal. I'm quite often here in Montreal. I appreciate the place and the academic density with this major academic institution in the same town and cooperating quite well together. I'm not saying very well because I don't know, and probably like in my town we have several also, and maybe looking fine from the outside, maybe it's more complicated. But really, I enjoy being here and having the opportunity to not only do my research, as Joanne said, I'm working in global law, and yes, one of the things I'm trying to figure out is that there certainly is a link between this issue of minority rights, minority representation in federal structure or in non-federal state structure, the role of local governments in national and supranational governance, as we have in the European Union, and this new paradigm of global law. So this is what I'm working on, and basically, yes, federation and multinational federation, even though you've understood I'm not so convinced by the concept, multinational federation are an interesting case to test some of the idea that can structure global law. So, I would say due to the fuzziness of the globalization process and the paradoxical nature of multinational federation, maybe I will start by giving a few definitions so that you can know what I'm talking about and maybe disagree or agree with what I'm saying. So, globalization, to start with, I would describe globalization for the purpose of today's speech. Naturally, globalization in general is a very complex and multidimensional phenomenon, and there's no way I could cover all the aspects of it just in 1 hour or 2 hour, 3 hour time, so don't worry, I'll be shorter than that. But so for the purpose of today's speech and the impact of globalization on multinational federation, I would say and describe globalization as the large victory of liberalism over republicanism. So far. Actually, I even consider that if the globalization process succeeds totally, it will probably also be the triumph of globalization over liberalism itself, which would be very paradoxical. But that would be the topic for another conference. Let's stick to multinational federation and the fact that republicanism is being strongly hit by globalization. Why do I say that? Because globalization, one of its most evident elements is that it frees private subjects, persons, legal persons or individuals, from public authorities' control. Eventually, entirely, which then would make liberalism as a, let's say, philosophical approach totally irrelevant, because basically the fundamental idea of liberalism is to develop liberties for people which are under the control of some sort of sovereign or public authority. So if it goes till the end, probably we'll be in a totally different ball game. But this potential freedom or emancipation of a legal and physical person from authorities does not concern all people, all legal person, all individual beings. Actually, it frees the multinational companies. Oh, by the way, multinational was probably used way before for companies than for federation, but we'll come back to it later. So it frees big multinational companies. It certainly frees the rich and highly skilled individual, but it doesn't apply or doesn't directly apply to small and medium enterprise or low qualified, non-English fluent workers. And all those that are not free from globalization feel threatened by it. So they turn to the state authorities for protection. And if you remember, this was actually the original duty of the sovereign, now the state authority exercising sovereignty, in the social contract explanation of sovereign power. The individual would relinquish their absolute liberty against the sovereign protection. But due to globalization, it becomes extremely difficult for the state to provide such protection without alienating itself and its population from the global economy. And I will show that later. But consequently, globalization makes it difficult for the state authorities to efficiently protect the national population. Actually, it makes it very difficult, if not impossible, to go on nation building, or I would even go as far as nation keeping, meaning keeping the elements of national cohesion within the polity that is the state, be it a federation or a national state, unitary state. And this is true both for nation states, national state or state in the sense of international law, but also for nation within a state. I would go as far as to say that nation building, even within a state, is made more irrealistic, more difficult by globalization. Even though, and I will also come back on that, there is certainly a big difference between the situation of a nation within a multinational federation and a nation within a national state. For example, Catalonia in Spain or Scotland in the UK and so on. I'll come back on that. So basically, what is being strongly impacted by globalization, in my view, is this relationship between the state authorities and the nation. And this is being clearly challenged by globalization. However, globalization will certainly not suppress bureaucracies or power structures. So states as structure will certainly remain. But probably this structure and institution will reorient their priorities for the benefit of the new transnational power structures instead of protecting their own population. And this leads, and I will also come back to that later, to the rise of populist parties, which we see everywhere, which is a very serious challenge for state legitimacy as I come back. So, this differentiated impact on national cohesion potential and on state structures, state authorities, is the very important element I would like to underline. And whether such a phenomenon would favor federal cohesion or weakens it in a multinational federation is very hard to tell. Because if the impacts are numerous and strong, they probably pull in different directions. So let's us keep that aside and have a few words on the use of nationality. Actually, I intervened last week in a PhD workshop at UQAM, in French, actually, there. And they were quite unhappy with my use of nations. They were not lawyers. I'm a lawyer, and I guess here the majority of you are lawyers. So to explain how and why I use nation, let Let me present you with a quote. I quote, "The imprecision of the concept of nation is compounded by difficulties in identifying obvious or any examples. The concept of the nation has played, however, an important role in contemporary state building, even though, unlike the case of language and religion, law has played almost no role in its understanding, regulation, or development. It is a creation principally of romantics, historians, philosophers, and patriots. It will inevitably suffer in treatment by a lawyer." Well, I think that pretty much summarizes the situation and the difficulty we have with this concept. The author is the late Patrick Glenn in his very interesting book, The Cosmopolitan State, which was published in 2013. So, again, I'm not in the capacity to discuss about the sociological or cultural or whatever form of existence of the nation, but only to discuss about this link between power structure and nation. And in a national federation, naturally, it is a complex link because you have several levels of power structure and you have several nations by definition, since it's called itself a multination. And the concept of nation, in its strict sense, is an instrument of closure. It allows to distinguish between us, the nation or those who belong to the nation, and the others, them, those who are not nation. There's a problem with binational, dual national. Maybe some of you have heard the huge debate going on in France about the potentiality for retrieving nationality to French citizens, maybe to dual national and not to single national French citizen whatsoever. And it's a very interesting debate, and it makes sense if you have a strong concept of nation. Now it may create problem in a multinational federation, like are Québécois binational? That's an interesting question. I'll come back to it. But the real problem we have is that very often, and actually I've been doing it since the beginning of my speech, we make an indiscriminate use of the term national and statal. And this is not only myself, I mean, this is the world we live in. The best example I have come from international law. My PhD is in international law, so sometime go back there. It's a preamble of the United Nations Charter. We, the peoples of the United Nations. So, okay, we have nations which get united, and there are people in this nation. Is it different? Is it the same thing? And if you look at the Charter beyond the preamble, then you realize it's only states who can become members. Article 3 and 4 of the Charter. So it means that Canadians are a people of the UN, no, a nation of the UN, and Québécois are not, because Quebec is not a member of the UN. And neither are Catalans, Scots, Kosovars, we're getting closer, Palestinians, and so on. That's the way the world is organized. So, for a nation to be united to other nations in the current international society, or the post-World War II international society, maybe we're changing. That's one of the questions that is opened by globalization. Well, the only way to be directly part of the United Nations is to become a state. Not necessarily a national state. The UN Charter doesn't care about that. Actually, the International Court of Justice, in its first advisory opinion on the condition to become a member state of the UN, said that the conditions are laid down in Article 4. There are 4 conditions and nothing more. And there is another word about nationality. Actually, if you look at the rest of the UN Charter, nations disappear. You either have states, member states, or you have people. People do exist, but actually the people are those proto-nation, let's say, a group of persons which consider themselves as probably a nation, which do not have their own state. And it has been restricted to people living under colonial rule. So, in the sense of the UN Charter, Quebec is not a people, more a nation in the sense of United Nations. It's just being out. And it's also true for the First Nations, for example, of Canada or anywhere else, because they don't live under colonial rule anymore. Because actually what happened, but it's true also in Latin America and so on, what happened is that those living under colonial rules that emancipated themselves were the colonists. But they emancipated themselves from the metropolitan authority, the British Crown, the Spanish Crown, whatsoever. And so it doesn't work twice. But that's another question. So, yeah, nation is not a term that has a lot of legal meaning in international law, which is not so important. Actually, the same International Court of Justice, in its 2010 opinion on the Declaration of Independence by Kosovo, said that no, Kosovo was not a people in the sense of the Charter. It didn't have a right to do so, but basically it didn't really matter because most states became state by declaring themselves independent, probably legally, and so on. So, nation, and in that way I would really join Glenn's reflection, is not a very legal concept as such. Definitely not in international law. And if it's true that it is used in some national law, especially constitutional law, it is not a very legal operational concept. It's rather symbolic. But you don't find many rights recognized to the nation as such. They recognize to federal entities, they recognize to local government or whatsoever, but nation is a difficult legal concept. So now, and naturally that's open for discussion, I hope we'll have time to discuss that. Now let's briefly move to multinational federation. What is that? I've been thinking about it, and I think we can have three cases of multinational federation. The first major distinction is whether the federation is a state or not. Somehow, the European Union is a multinational federation, in my view. That can be discussed, but I think it has most of the federal structure, but the European Union is definitely not a state. So it's a multinational federation where you have several nations inside a federation which itself is not a state, and probably not a nation. It's clear that EU is not a state. Actually, EU tried still at the United Nations to improve its observer status at the United Nations because they think they're very different from other international organizations, and basically the UN said no. There was a 2011 resolution saying, well, you know, if you want to call yourself observer, no problem, but any other international organization who will ask for it will also get it. So actually, if you look at it, the International Committee of Red Cross has a better statute at the General Assembly of the UN than the European Union, but that's another point. On the other hand, Canada is a multinational state. And also a federation, but you can be a multinational state without being a federation. Spain don't want to be called a federation, but it's obviously a multinational state. UK is probably also a multinational state, and so on. So, first distinction, multinational federation is a state or non-state. And within the state category, then I also have two possible distinctions. The first one, I would say the most satisfying from a logical point of view, would be that the federal state does not consider itself as a national state. It's considered itself as a federal state composed of nations inside, which probably are the federal entities, or some of the federal entities. And so you have some sort of a symmetrical system, where you have nations below the federal level, and then the federation encompasses nations. And that makes it quite simple. I wouldn't have many difficulties with that type of multinational federation, except that it doesn't really exist. Again, EU would probably be the best example, and you have some thinker, philosopher, and so on, like someone like Habermas has been writing this idea that, you know, EU could become some sort of a post-national state, where at the EU level you would have belonging to a common polity, with this constitutionalist patriotism, as he called it, and so on. So detached from any national effect at the federal level, and still having nation inside. Naturally, it's not what the European Federalists want. They want a real European nation at the European level, which creates many problems, but that's also another debate. Now the third type is certainly what we have in Canada, now at least, which is a multinational federation which is composed of a national federation. Canada has built itself as a national state. And this is why, I mean, when you go to Ottawa, it's not the federal capital, it's the national capital. And inside this nation, you have one group of people who also call themselves a nation, Quebec and Québécois. And naturally, Quebec is the national capital of Quebec. So Canada has two national capitals, which for foreigners is a bit strange. And then again, we get to the question of this binational situation of Québécois, which I think is quite problematic. So this third type of multinational federation, I would call that an asymmetric multinational federation. And again, in that case, and there have no religion, I mean, mine is not made. We may even consider Canada as a multinational state, not only because of Quebec nation and the Canadian nation, but also adding the First Nations. Then it becomes even more asymmetrical because the First Nations, as such, are not federal entities. So, I mean, they have plenty of rights and so on, but not like the Quebec.
And the Acadians.
Sorry?
And the Acadians.
And the Acadians. Well, yes.
Well, no,
okay, the Acadians, they're neither First Nation nor have control of a federal entity, for sure. So, but there may be a nation. Actually, I think it's very self-defining element to call yourself a nation. But anyway, what is interesting, certainly, is the issue of nationality and citizenship in a federation. And the classical way it is settled is that it's the federal level which recognizes the citizenship. Maybe, like in Switzerland, we have to have approval from 3 levels, from the cantonal, from the communal, and from the federal. But basically, if you're a Swiss citizen or if you're a Canadian citizen, you can go anywhere in the country. You cannot be forbidden to go and settle. Again, I leave out the case of First Nation and some of the territorial rights, but any Canadian could come to Quebec and work and live in Quebec. So it makes it very difficult for a nation inside a multinational federation to exert closure, because basically you don't control your border. This is what political philosophers call the principle of hospitality, meaning that entities inside the federation cannot effectively exert closure against the rest of the population of the federation. Actually, Quebec, tried by using some elements linked to language, the famous Law 101 and so on. And interestingly, you had a strong reaction from the federation. And they've been fighting against this attempt at closure, among other ways, by a very liberal grounding of the individual rights of Canadians to use their own language, and naturally the repatriation of the Charter in 1982 has certainly something to do with I'm not sure of the exact word, but making ineffective the efforts of Quebec to bring a strong degree of closure on the Quebec nation. And it probably was quite successful. So, as I say, inside the federation, closure is difficult, but even on the federation, globalization very strongly prevents closure. And this has a strong impact on the nation-building capacity. I will give 3 short examples. The first one is certainly the global regime of human rights. The way the existing nation states have been built would not be admitted today. The right of minorities, the individual rights of a person would be protected against the build-up of national unity. In France, after the Second World War, they were forbidding children to speak their own native local language in school. I mean, not even in the classroom, but even anywhere near the school, to make sure that they would have this French national unity. And I mean, we see the same problem in Turkey with the Kurds. Naturally, I don't know how Bosnia and Herzegovina will manage to build any form of national identity and so on, because this provision of human rights make it very difficult to exert a strong closure. Actually, if you go to the ultimate idea of protection of human rights, which is right to protect, actually even state sovereignty could be challenged on the basis of individual right protection. So universal human rights regime makes nation building less relevant and more difficult to achieve. Now, two remarks. First, that's unfortunately only theory. We know that there is no general enforceable regime for protection of human rights. And second, it is probably relevant, assuming it could function, for what we call first generation human rights. But it does not apply to social and economic rights. There we admit that the access to these social and economic rights can be limited on the ground of nationality or belonging to the community of the state. I mean, it doesn't have to be a national state. But then globalization, economic globalization, create a real problem for states because, I will argue, it makes it almost impossible for states to continue to provide the degree of social economic rights that have been provided. Why? Because the no-closure principle in international relation, economic relation, is imposed basically by WTO rules. Actually, it's not WTO, it's a GATT rule, General Agreement on Trade and Tariff, first article, what is called the clause of the most favored nation. By the way, nation again, even though it's between states, which say that any commercial advantage you give to any state in the world, you should give it to any other member of the WTO. So basically, states do not have the capacity to close their market anymore, meaning that goods can come in, and we'll see it's very important for reflection on multinational federation. It also means that industries, national industry, can delocalize in another country and still have access to the national market. So it really makes it very difficult for states to keep this social and economic rights as a national social economic rights. And even further, one of the big problems states now have is that they're becoming unable to tax the big global players. You've certainly read and heard about these multinational corporations which have their central location in Ireland or in Geneva. We have a lot in Geneva. Yes? Okay, no comments. But, well, that's the way it goes. That's part of the game. But basically, states are not able to tax anymore. And it's very interesting because that's one of the very central raison d'être and function of the state, to tax and to redistribute. So states are not ready to cooperate in an international agreement to find a way to agree on common condition and taxation, which will make it impossible for the big global players to escape taxation. But they have to do something. So now there is a very unknown process, which is called BEPS, base erosion and profit shifting, which is being conducted through OECD. You have 20 reports that have been presented and adopted, actually they've just been presented and they say they're adopted, which contain 20 standards that all the states will probably implement in their national legislation in order to try to regain a capacity to tax big global players. But basically, this redistributive function of the state, which was very important to maintain national cohesion, is being strongly challenged by globalization. Very interesting writing on that by Pierre Rosanvallon, a French historian, who shows very clearly how this works. My third example is what I call global security. If you remember the social contract theory, the first and foremost duty of the sovereign power is to keep the citizen secure, safe, alive, in peace. And I will argue that globalization does not allow states to do so. Actually, the most powerful state in the world, just south of the border, on 11 September 2001, was attacked on its territory. But actually, the attack was generated on its territory. It was a criminal case problem. It was not an international act of war, as was said. Or was it? Nobody knows. Nobody knows because globalization makes it impossible to have this closure, as regards security, between international and domestic security. And 9/11 is very revealing of that fact, and immediately, almost immediately after he's gone out of his hiding, President Bush said it's an act of war. Well, a very strange act of war, because basically everything happened inside the territory of the United States. US plane taking off from the US territory and crashing on the US territory. But it was an act of war. Same line of thoughts, what happened in France on 13 November last year, and then French president declaring to his people, we're at war. And actually it's true. France was at war already, but no French person realized that. French was fighting in Mali, was fighting, and is still, in Iraq and Syria. And so, actually, even the distinction between peace and war is not possible anymore in the time of globalization. And very interestingly, in 2011, a coalition of countries went to bomb Libya, which was probably an act of war, even though there was an authorization from the Security Council, and Belgium participated to the coalition. But Belgium had no government at that time. So how can a government, which is limited to affaires courantes, current affairs, decide to go to war? Is it a current affair for government? Well, certainly not in the classical organization of the world. Maybe, yes, in the globalized world. But so basically, even this closure, the security closure, is not efficient anymore. So basically, state capacity to protect the nation is very, very challenged. There's a fourth example, but I won't talk about it today. Those who are interested, I'm giving another blah blah next Monday on the migrant crisis for Europe. But that's also very interesting because this is even the substance of nation that is being challenged. You cannot control who comes or not on the territory. So let's leave that apart and see now the impact of globalization on state structure. What happens is that globalization has a strong effect on state organization, on the equilibrium within a state, especially on what we call the division of power. Globalization has strongly strengthened executive power, weakened to a dramatic level parliamentary power, and, but in a strange way, strengthened judiciary power. For executive power, basically, they are the one who represent the state, who participate in the global decision making. In all these forums where you adopt new international norms, they represent the states, and then they come back at home and tell the parliament, you know, you have to implement the norm, ratify the treaty, or just write it down in the national law, because that's the way it is. And their role of intermediates between the international and the national level makes them much more powerful. And also, globalization is not only a scale shift, moving decision level to a higher level, but it is also a time shift. I took the idea from Saskia Sassen, a very 2006, very interesting book, 2006, called Territory, Authorities and Rights, really deserves reading. And basically, the time for decision making is not the time of politics anymore, it's the time of the economy. And if you look at what happened in 2008 and after, during the global economic crisis, let's call it this way, it's very interesting to see that most of the major decisions by policymakers were taken after the closure of the New York Stock Exchange and before the opening of the Asian markets. That's the time for politics nowadays. And this is hours where Parliament is not sitting. And that's the way it takes place. Because, again, we have it as a equilibrium between political and economic power. So, executive power, even though it can be discussed whether it's the elected politician or some executive agencies, which also with a series of other problems, benefits from globalization. The parliaments are very weakened for several reasons. First, because they have to comply with the international commitment of the state, and naturally that limits very much their political freedom to make choices. Not only international commitment, but all sort of international standards are being implemented by national parliaments. Standard accounting procedure and this and that, which very often are created by professional organizations, but national parliaments cannot evade them, cannot inflect them. So the space for political debate, for national parliament has been strongly reduced, not to mention the global markets requirements. We've lived that in a very difficult situation in Europe. So I would say parliaments are being short-circuited by globalization. Short-circuited?
Short-circuited.
Yeah. By globalization. One interesting example is about the country where I come from, Switzerland, which is a very sovereign country, a very autonomous one. You know, it's not member of the EU, even though it's surrendered by the EU. It waited until 2002 to join the UN, because it would be relinquishing its sovereignty and so on. But even though, actually some political scientists have found this fantastic formula. They call that autonomous adaptation. So Parliament is doing autonomous adaptation. And it shows that 80% of the laws that are being voted by the Swiss Parliament are just adaptation to either EU or international obligations. Whether they're formal law, whether they're soft law, that doesn't matter. I mean, we're very sovereign, but we have to adapt. So that's a problem for Parliament. And naturally, it strengthens judges, but not inside the national or the federal system. Actually, the judge become not only the custodian of the system, but they become those who have to negotiate its opening to other legal orders, be they international orders, be they other national orders. We see more and more extraterritorial implementation of laws, or non-state-made legal order. So basically, yes, the judge gets strengthened, but that doesn't help us as regards the equilibrium inside the Multinational Federation, because it's other elements that come into play. So to sum up, and more or less to conclude, because I see I'm being too talkative again. To resume, globalization has a major impact on the state-nation relationship. State and nation cannot be equated anymore, or used indistinctively anymore. Nationals, as citizens of state, realize that the state authorities are not working anymore for the protection of the nation. Thus all those populist movements and so on. Very interestingly also, if you're interested on that, Ulrich Beck, a German sociologist, in 2004 was talking about ethno-nationalism as a reaction to globalization. Or, naturally, the alternative to ethno-nationalism is probably the cosmopolitan state that Glenn was arguing for. But that's not a very national vision of the state. Actually, it's an anti-national, non-national vision, pre-national, basically, vision of the state. So now, to conclude the impact of globalization on multinational federation when we have all these elements. One of the things that is interesting is that globalization has probably a differentiated impact on federal state than on unitary state. Not only has it an impact on the horizontal equilibrium of power, it also has an impact on the vertical equilibrium of power. Now, there are two possibilities. Some argue, and I tend to agree with them, that this has for the effect to aspire provincial or federated entities' competence towards the federal national level, because, again, of this role of intermediation with international commitment of the state authorities, because of global risks which necessitate negotiation at the highest possible level and so on. So basically, this strengthening of the executive is not only as regard parliament, but also as regard competence of the infra-state entities, unit of the federation. Naturally, that creates a problem because at the national federal level, the equilibrium, the federal equilibrium, was most often realized inside the parliament with the two-chamber system whatsoever. And if parliament is being weakened and executive is being strengthened, then many of the federal equilibrium are being threatened. Now what we see is in parallel the emergence of new, I would say, power institutional formation where, I mean, you see that in Canada, 2 weeks ago you had this conference of prime minister and so on, where the executive from the different levels work together in order to try to do some policy making. So that may be another equilibrium that appears. But very clearly, you have this going towards the central authorities' tendency. Some argue the opposite. For example, scholars like Michael Keating and so on say, well, because of economic globalization, the role of the national scale, state scale, as we get access to market, become irrelevant, and what becomes really relevant are the local conditions for enterprise, for people who live there, and so on. And so local or regional power are more relevant than international, than the national scale. That's probably true, but that doesn't help nation building. I would say that these regional power, or those cities that make themselves good players in the global world, are not building local nations. They're being global cities, as Saskia Sasson called them. So they're being hubs for globalization, but not central place to build up a nation. So that does not really help. But what is important, on the other hand, is that globalization makes the exit cost from the multinational federation much lower for regional entities. Quebec becoming independent would be much less problematic in economic terms nowadays than it would have been 20 or 30 years ago. So that balance, I would say, the federal equilibrium, somehow more power tends to go to the center, but the center has to be quite careful because the sub-national entities or sub-federal entities may be tempted to go out. And there I see a real advantage for multinational federation. Because in multinational federation, the concept of the nation and the state are already separated. So this impact of globalization and the link between nation and state is much more diffuse in a multinational federation because this link is already much more complex and diffuse in a multinational federation. So that's very important. For a classical nation state, globalization shakes the whole model and the whole concept of nation state. That's one of the reasons, I think, why France has so many difficulties to adapt, to reform, because their whole conceptual model is being challenged. And even worse, for the non-federal multinational state, remember, the exit cost the exit cost is much lower with globalization. And what makes it very different in these states compared to multinational federation is that the nation within these states have a strong feeling of being denied their rights, which is not as strong in the multinational federation. Naturally, it's not the absolute sovereignty, becoming your own nation state in the United Nations and so on, but still you have some rights recognized, you have some procedures to have your voice heard. It's much less the case in those states where you have nation, in states which are not multinational federation. And this is probably why you have this temptation from Scots, Catalans, Basques, naturally, they've not gone away, just right now, but they come back, to walk out of the state. They can do it, and especially in Europe, if they can stay in the European Union, then the exit cost is almost nil. So basically, multinational federations are in a much better situation than those states or classical national states. So, two conclusions. I swear that's the conclusion. First, as I said from the beginning, by default, multinational federation seems to be a better answer in the age of globalization than a so-called national state in which exist different nations or a classical national state. Second, and this is, so I mean, basically, it means that the oxymoron, that is a multinational federation, is a viable one. After all, why not? But at the cost of a relative notion of nation. It's not nation in its strong sense. It cannot be. Second, and that is a current research hypothesis for me, so any comment or suggestion on it are not welcome. Basically, as we saw, globalization does not allow closure. What did ensure power legitimacy, state legitimacy before, was its capacity to close and to include, thus the limited holistic conception of nation, to include citizens by delivering security and well-being. In a time of globalization, what may legitimate power could not be this capacity to close anymore, but is probably the capacity to prevent the territory and its population being excluded from the mainstream of globalization, to remain a player, to be able to attract investors, smart people. So naturally, you don't have to be your own, blood brother and classical conception of nation, but to remain part of this global game for the benefit of the whole population. So, what I'm saying there is what the political scientists call output legitimacy. Basically, you are legitimate because you're successful. And that's quite important. But it is at odds with input legitimacy, which is still based on the classical national base of the state, the voters, even those who are losers from globalization. And I think this is this discrepancy between input and output legitimacy that creates the major difficulty for sustaining polities as state structure. And so, my intuition is that there may be in the basic principle of federal models, which by definition is a way to combine closure and openness, the united in diversity formula. There may be some elements that may allow for the reconciliation of the contradictory injunction of output and input legitimacy, which certainly would be at the cost of traditional national logic, which was found in a state-based world, but which probably does not work anymore in the global world we're living in. So I think I will stop there, and thank you for being patient.
Yes.